Without further ado, I want to welcome our moderator for this evening's discussion. She's the Dean of the College of Education. She is a PhD in Educational Psychology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Please welcome Dean Marcy Driscoll.
It's certainly my pleasure to be here, and Josh mentioned that I did my degree at UMass Amherst, but I have been in Tallahassee a very long time. This is my 32nd year at Florida State, so I am definitely a Seminole, and have been for a long time. And it's truly my pleasure to be here, because education is clearly, it's a very important thing, and I think it's one of the things all of us would consider to be important. We have three panelists to welcome to you. I'm going to introduce them first, then sort of set the stage. Then we have several video clips interspersed with our discussion. We'll have our first video clip, and then I'll direct the first question. We'll have some canned questions that the student group that put this together have given to me, and then after about 45 minutes or so, we'll have open discussion and questions from the audience. So you will have plenty of time to direct questions to our panelists. So let me welcome them up. We have Catherine Robinson of Students First. Catherine is a regional outreach manager for Students First. Students First is a grassroots movement that puts laws and leaders in place so that students' interests come before special interests. She manages, organizes, and activates a membership of over 148,000 parents, teachers, and community leaders in Florida. A 25-year activist with the Florida Democrats, she also taught social studies, and we were talking earlier, she's from Tampa. She's taught social studies for troubled and delinquent youth, as well as mainstream and special education students in a traditional public high school in Tampa. She wrote regular columns for the Tampa Tribune, Creative Loafing, and other newspapers, only becoming concerned about the state of public education in Florida. Her twin sons are currently in the 7th grade, and I learned that they, like I, am Boston Red Sox fans, so that's right. That's exciting. Our second panelist, Kim McDougall. Kim is Governor Scott's Chief of Education. She is serving as the Education Policy Coordinator in the Executive Officer of the Governor. She has previously served as a Deputy K-12 Chancellor for Policy Development and Special Projects, and the Director of Government Relations at the Department of Education here in Florida. Prior to joining the department, she had served as Governor Bush's Education Policy Coordinator. Ms. McDougall began her legislative career as a senior policy analyst in the Florida legislature, concentrating on K-12 education issues. She received her undergraduate degree from Tulane University and her master's and PhD in education from Florida State. So we're very happy to have her back on campus. And our third panelist is Jaren Emhoff. Jaren is the Director of State Initiatives and Communications for the Foundation of Excellence in Education. As the Communications Director, she serves as spokeswoman for the foundation and facilitates media inquiries and interview requests. As Director of State Initiatives, she leads the advocacy team in coordination with the policy team as they work with state policy organizations, business leaders, lawmakers, and state policymakers to advance bold reforms to improve student achievement. Jaren joined the foundation from the Florida Senate, where she served for 10 years, working as a legislative assistant and most recently communications director for Senate President Jeff Atwater. So that's our panelist. Now let me try to set the stage a little bit. One of the things about education is that we are full of jargon and lots of acronyms as well. So some of the things that our panelists will undoubtedly be talking about, I thought I would try to give you a few definitions first, just in case you aren't aware of some of these things. So we have the No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB, which was a bipartisan act that was enacted in 2001. It was a standards-based education reform act that was part of a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is a real mouthful. But it required states to develop and administer assessments for basic skills. It included measurements of adequate yearly progress, AYP, you'll hear that talked about, have schools met AYP, It required highly qualified teachers in schools, and it disaggregated test results really for the first time. So when we do a lot of like FCAT testing and stuff like that, it used to be that states could simply report all its test results in a single group, and so you could do it by school. Well, NCLB required that it be disaggregated, so for the first time we could really see whether some groups were performing better in achievement than other groups. And in fact, that sort of it demonstrated what we now know as the achievement gap, where we have some segments of our student population, namely typically the white population, is outperforming in achievement our African American and Hispanic populations. And we also have Race to the Top. This is came out under the Obama administration, RTTT, or RT cubed, I guess they often call it, which was providing grants to the states to try to achieve innovation and education reform. There were certain elements that had to be included in the Race to the Top grants if we were granted one, and Florida did get one, which included things like teacher evaluation systems, really looking at models to measure student growth from year to year, and then even looking at bringing together the student growth model and teacher performance. One other element was in turning around low-performing schools is one of the things that it focused on. You'll hear our panelists, I think, probably talk about charter schools. There are, I don't recall the exact number in Florida any longer, but it's over 500 charter schools in the state. These are public schools. They receive public funding, but they are not subject to the same rules and regulations as your standard public school, but they have to demonstrate certain kinds of accountability. So it was trading accountability for rules and regulation. That's been coupled with the notion of school choice, which is when there are failing schools or schools are not performing up to the standard that parents are looking for, they have the option of choosing a school, often a charter school, for their kids to meet special needs. School vouchers you may hear talked about tonight a little bit, and that's the notion of having the funding follow the student as opposed to following the school. So there are proposals where the students would actually then be able to choose a school, use the funding that would have come to them via the state, but to send them to the school of their choice. Two other things very quickly. Merit pay. This is actually part of a bill in Florida. Senate Bill 736 was enacted last year. You may have heard a year before Senate Bill 6 was enacted, but then vetoed by former Governor Christ, and then reenacted as Senate Bill 736 and signed by Governor Scott, which brought, coupled the notion of teachers being rewarded in merit pay for the achievement of their students. The achievement as measured not only by FCAT, approximately half of the award would be coupled to FCAT, but then other measures of student achievement as well. And then finally, Common Core Standards, you may hear talked about. This is a national effort that was begun or coordinated by the National Governors Association along with the Council for Chief State School Officers to really establish what are the standards, what is it that kids need to know and be able to do to be successful in the 21st century. So it is a national effort that was begun. There are now 45 states, including Florida, that have signed on to it. And these are, having been adopted in Florida now, the kinds of assessments that are being used to measure student achievement are being coordinated to the Common Core. So that's kind of the vocabulary lesson for the evening. And so we'll start first, I think, with our first video. Okay, so the first question is directed at Jaren. And so how does Race to the Top increase the measures of accountability at the state level and also increase innovation?
Race to the Top builds on what you mentioned earlier on national No Child Left Behind. And thing about No Child Left Behind that was so dynamic at its point in time was there were states that literally didn't have accountability systems before No Child Left Behind, or they were incredibly rudimentary. So when that bill was passed, it said every state has to have an accountability system by which it measures student achievement, student growth, what have kids learned over a year's time. And Race to the Top could almost be, the structure is different. Race to the Top was a competitive grant, so states could choose to participate and to compete for the grant, so to speak. No Child Left Behind was federal law that was put in place, but you could almost make the case that it was the second generation of No Child Left Behind in a way, and that it took it to the next level and said, okay, if you want the funds that we're offering, and there was $1 billion plus monies that states were competing for, there are certain criteria or certain promises that you have to make in order to be eligible to compete. That included data systems. So what is the data behind the accountability that you're pulling? How can you disaggregate it well? Can you really kind of go down into the school level and see if a school what are the students in that school doing? For a state like Florida, we have a high transitory population. So a student may have started out in Miami-Dade, moved to Orlando. Is their school achievement and student achievement data following them throughout, or does the poor teacher in Orlando who is getting, let's say it's a 7th grade student, have no idea where their academic basics is? So it went into data. It required, the other thing that was probably the most revolutionary for the time was the teacher evaluation requirement. All teacher evaluations a state had to commit to include that student learning data that they were supposed to be capturing into the annual evaluations to be able to say, how well are these teachers moving their students along their academic path? What is the process, the state of learning that child has when they walk into the classroom, and at the end of that school year, where are they? And then using that to say, okay, teacher, how well did you, with all the factors involved, move this child through learning a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time, and being able to recognize maybe that child was behind when they came in, maybe that child was an AP student coming in, an honors student, you name it, or maybe it was just she was on grade level, he was on grade level and continued along that trajectory. Those were probably the two most founding things about Race to the Top. The results aren't clear yet. It was just, Florida got theirs in 2010. 2010, we received our award. They said that we got about $700 million, I think. And I believe the final implementation doesn't take effect until 2014. So we still have a couple years before they can say did Race to the Top work or not.
Would either of the other panelists like to comment?
I think there were two other aspects of it. Mm-hmm. In Florida, we've had the Sunshine State Standards, we've had the Next Generation State Standards, and we're moving to the Common Core State Standards. And I think Race to the Top was the precursor to the Common Core State Standards, where there were 4 primary components to Race to the Top. And the first one, you had to have standards, because not all states are like Florida, they didn't have standards. You had to have a common set of standards, and you had to have an assessment system. And then you had to have teacher effectiveness and also principal effectiveness, because we all know principals are the instructional leaders, and the stronger the principal and the better the principal, especially in terms of being an instructional leader, the chances are the students are going to perform better in that school. And like Jaron said, you had to have a quality data center, because you have to have the data, and Florida is actually one of the leading states in the nation in terms of K-20 data. And then the fourth component of it was you had to focus on the lowest performing schools in your state. You had to have a plan. How did you designate which ones were your lowest performing schools? What was your plan, and what resources were you going to put towards those schools to ensure that there was greater student achievement at those schools? So there were 4 components.
One of the interesting things that I want to particularly comment on is the notion of the data systems. And Kim just mentioned Florida is a state that has some of the best data in the entire nation, and has had for longer than pretty much any state in the nation. And that has really, I think, served us extremely well through all of these initiatives. And one of the other things that's happening that's really pushing, as I see in my own college, is not only are we looking at how teachers, what they do in principals and how that affects student achievement, we're beginning to ask the question, well, how is the preparation of teachers and school leaders, how is that related to the impact that they're having on K-12 achievement? And we can only ask those questions now because of the data systems that we have in the state. So it's really, I think, moved the conversation in a pretty positive way.
I think another aspect of Race to the Top that's really exciting is that it encourages states to remove arbitrary caps on charter schools, so we can have more great public charter schools and more choice for parents. It also encourages states to be innovative, and as long as they're held to high standards, that innovation can really open up schools to all kinds of possibilities for different kinds of students.
I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit, because one of the next questions was for you, Catherine, which is, do you foresee any potential impediments to scaling charter schools? What are the benefits? Is this a sustainable, viable solution as we anticipate the future of K-12 education?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think creating more charter schools means creating more choices for parents and students. As far as the benefits, I think more school choice. It's really important that students and parents be able to kind of pick the schools that work for them and meet their needs. As far as impediments, I think it's important. I don't know if these are impediments, but I think it's important to make sure that these schools have adequate funding. I think it's important that they have access to facility support, and we remove the caps on charter schools, and also fast track replication of high-performing public charter schools. And if this happens, it's sustainable. And it really is important, like I said, for all the kids that are kind of right now on waiting lists or feel like they're kind of trapped by their zip code.
Okay. And Kim, next question for you. What effects will the $1 billion increase to a K-12 education that both Governor Scott and President Obama support might have in the state university system?
Hello. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Appreciate being here. State budgeting is very complicated. So when you're doing the state budget, the legislators and the governors look at the state's budgets and needs much like you look at your own budget. Some years you have more in your budget, some years you have less, depending on how much you worked and how much revenue you had coming in. So when you look at the state budget, there's what we call in the capital world budget drivers. Increased costs for Medicaid. You have environment issues that have to be taken care of. You have a whole lot of issues that have to be taken care of. And when the governor does his budget and when the legislature does his budget, correct me if I'm wrong since you're the legislative queen, they have to make decisions, and they start off by allocating dollars to different areas. And so some of it's already decided, like K-12, you have to fund the kids that show up, so you have enrollment budget drivers. Community colleges, theirs is also based on enrollment. You have VPK, you have a lot of things that are already in place. So because you increase funding in K-12, it's not necessarily a takeaway from the university system or takeaway from anywhere else. What it is a definitive statement by legislative leaders or Governor Scott. He thinks that right now this is his #1 priority. Especially, you've probably heard Governor Scott is into making sure every Floridian can have a job. And you have to have an education to have a job. And if you're going to bring companies to Florida, guess what? You have to have an educated workforce. We're competing very heavily with other states to bring new companies and to expand existing companies in Florida. We have to demonstrate that we have the workforce here. We have a service industry, but we have high tech. A lot of the application tech companies, you probably don't know this, they're in Florida. So we have we're not just Orange Groves and Disney Worlds and Universal. We have a very high tech companies in Florida, so we have to have the workforce in it. And when we're competing, we have to sell those companies that we will have the workforce there to make those companies profitable and make Floridians happier because they're bringing home a paycheck. So in game, it's not, you can't tie one thing to another thing. It's about prioritizing, just like you prioritize where your money's going to go. The legislature and the governor prioritize where they believe the funds should go.
So talk a little bit about the funding of charter schools, and I'll open up to the panel. They are funded through the same mechanisms as regular public schools. So the notion is, so Catherine's saying we should potentially open the door to more charter schools. Well, if there's a limited pot of money, then wouldn't it be taking money out of other schools to fund charter schools?
No.
Okay.
What the state does is the state funds public school students. And your destiny of your education options and choices should not be defined by your zip code. Just because the neighborhood that you're born in and raised in, your family lives there, shouldn't lock you into that. And charter schools are a wonderful opportunity to provide every parent with a choice. So how the funding works. We fund public school students. Charter schools are public schools. Charter school students are in the school grading system. They take the state assessments. And actually, charter schools receive less money than a kid going to a traditional public school, which I'm a huge advocate. I probably have the most expensive teaching certificate in the country because I got it from Tulane. But that's another thing. We'll talk about trying to figure out how much you pay for your education as to the job that you're going to get when you come out of it. So I love teachers and I love public schools. So the money follows the kid. So it's a public school kid. It just so happens to be that child going into a public school that's a charter school. And the folks that open that school, they do have, Dean Driscoll's right, that school has greater flexibility, but they also have a contract. If they don't meet their performance contract that they've agreed to with the school board, they get terminated. We have some traditionally chronically low performing schools. We do turnaround options, change the principal, a lot of things. They never close. Charter school, it's a contract with the school board. So yes, you're not taking money away from the public school system. Those kids are still in the school system. They're just going to another building. So it's not a minus because you're going to have to fund them wherever they go.
Okay. Any further comments on that?
I think you pretty covered it.
Yeah. One of the things that I might ask a little bit about is the evidence for the performance of charter schools. That one of the things that you often hear questioned is how effective are charter schools in comparison to public schools. And most of the evidence indicates that they're about as effective and about as ineffective. You have the broad range of effectiveness in charter schools as you do with public schools. I think perhaps the difference is the contract that Kim's talking about. That if there is continuing ineffectiveness in a charter school, then they are subject to being shut down, which wouldn't be so true, I think, with a public school.
And some studies show that actually charter schools are more effective for kids that are from undervalued neighborhoods. And so that's reason enough, I think, to really study charter schools as a whole and see just how well they really are helping. Because I talk to students all over the state of Florida and parents all over the state of Florida, and there are so many schools that are actually diving into these previously ignored, undervalued neighborhoods and providing just a really great choice for these kids where no choice existed before.
One of the things, of course, that we hope will come out of the discussion that we have tonight is really trying to showcase the differences in the platforms of the two candidates. So I think our next video clip speaks to the Romney platform. Okay, so the first question is for Catherine. So how has Governor Romney distinguished himself from the president on the issue of school choice? What's really different between the two platforms?
Well, both candidates actually support a lot of choices for parents. Governor Romney, it sets himself apart by, obviously, as you just heard, he wants dramatically alter, and open up choices for parents. President Obama did a lot with Race to the Top, giving parents choices and also tying accountability to teacher evaluations and making sure that that's linked to student performance or student growth. And also, like I mentioned earlier, he wants to remove arbitrary caps that limit the amount of charter schools in a state. Where Governor Romney does really want to open up and allow more choices, he wants federal funds to kind of go with the students. That's a little bit different. And that's where I think his main difference is. The rest are very similar. Although I will say that Governor Romney doesn't really tie that flexibility to strong rules, ensuring that those schools, whether public or private, that take public funds, kind of held to high accountability standards and make sure that there's a way to guarantee that student performance or student growth. But that's the main difference.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question for Jaron. So what can we expect from what Governor Romney's platform has proposed relative to Title I grants and redistribution based on what we know so far?
So based on his plan and what he was referring to there when he talked about opening up federal funds in an unprecedented way is the Title I. And Title I funding, federal funds have been in existence for decades. Right now they're formula based, and they are specifically geared towards low-income students. So based on a formula, states and their student population that is low income, they get so many dollars that come in, and it goes into the school district. And what Governor Romney's plan has proposed is to say that those funds that are currently flowing through, if the state, so let's take Florida for an example, because it'll vary, Florida that has a pretty broad array choice. We have public schools that we've talked about. There's public school choice where you can move from school to school. There's charters that we've talked about, and then there's specific scholarship programs, scholarships for students with disabilities, scholarships for low-income students, which are essentially a voucher where families, if you're eligible and you qualify, you can get monies and take that to another public school, a charter school, or a parochial or private institution. And so what Governor Romney is proposing is loosening up some of those Title I funds so that if you're a student in a school that qualifies to receive Title I funding, but you want to go to a neighboring charter school, or you want to go to a private institution or a parochial institution, those Title I funds that you qualify for in the public school would follow you to that private institution. It would be dependent on the state having such laws, because the federal government couldn't supersede that, or he hasn't proposed that in his plan that I've seen.
Would either of the other panelists like to add in or comment on?
To say just how would it impact Florida?
Yeah.
So you're going to vote in Florida and you're Floridians. Right now, as Jaron alluded to, we have the Corporate Tax Credit Scholarship Program. And that's a scholarship program that's primarily used by low-income minority students, but it's funded by a Corporate Tax Credit Scholarship Program. What this would do, it would allow the federal funds, and as you know, as taxpayers, we need to use some of our taxpayers how we want to use it, so we would be able to use those dollars to help. There's always a waiting list for the Corporate Tax Credit Scholarship Program, and it is for minority low-income families. And we do have the McKay Scholarship Program, and again, that would let us use our federal dollars to allow more parents to participate in the program of choice that they want their kids to go to. It will be new for other states, but in Florida, we have those programs. It would be definitely a different funding model, and more kids would be able to participate in the programs.
Okay. I think we're ready for our third clip. Now we're going to kind of refocus a little to higher education. So the first question is to Kim. Can you help to provide any insight as to why the cost of tuition has increased for college students? And what is the federal government doing to support college students and to keep college affordable, and specifically in respect to the Pell Grants?
When do I get an easy question?
You get the budget questions.
I think one of the things that the federal government has done lately is kept the interest rates low. The Pell Grant average award is $3,800. The interest rate is 3.4%. It was going to be 6.8%. So obviously, if you can keep the interest rate low, that helps all students. And it's an interesting. It's pretty much the institutions in the states set the tuition rates. So the federal government, their role pretty much there is for the Pell Grant and other student financial aid opportunities.
Right.
Now, in the state, it's a whole other story. Would you like to hear the rest of the story? Even though you're here to get credit? I'm sorry, you can't change the channel. There is a big debate between affordability and high quality. I think you can have affordable universities and a high quality. If you put together a sheet today, and I've seen it before, and it's interesting because opposite sides, some folks want, how many people in here want your tuition increased? Okay, I know there's one in here or two. I think it's great. I think Florida State is an awesome university. Don't throw me out. I think the University of Florida is an awesome university. But I think part of what makes our university system so awesome is we're affordable. I think access and affordability for higher ed is one of the most important things today in Florida. So guess what? You have to keep the tuition rates low. Families have to be able to plan. They have to know how much it's going to cost. And so I think you keep it low by keeping it low. I think there's greater debates and discussion. What is the role of the universities? We have 11 and now soon to be 12 universities. It's different. I'm much older. When I wanted to use a computer, I had to go to the Stone building and use one of the 6 computers. I mean, we didn't really have all that. Things have changed. You have virtual education. Do you need to keep building buildings? Have we leveraged all the right policy decisions? I don't know how many of the smart people in here earn dual enrollment credit in high school, so we paid for that in high school when you were in high school in Florida, and then you didn't use them towards your 120 hours of your university. So I think there's policy decisions that can make us more financially responsible. Those are tough battles because everybody wants the money. The public school system, the state college system, we have an awesome state college system. Our 2+2 systems help keep the cost down. How many people in here went to a state college system before coming to FSU? There, see, work on that 2+2. That's an affordability factor. You get your AA or AS at the state college system, and then you come to the university. So it's really about making decisions, and at the university level, I'll talk a little bit about this. Over the past 5 or 6 years, the state support has gone down, so the tuition has raised. But over the past 5 or 6 years, the total state and tuition has been the same. And then if you go back to like 2005-06, I think the total revenue for all 11 state universities that they had to play with was $8 billion. Fast forward to today, it was $10 billion, because a lot of people focus on state funds and the tuition. Well, if you actually go online, I know if you really want to do research, go and look at your university's budget. The universities actually have a whole lot of revenue sources beyond state support and tuition. They get student housing, research, grants, licensing fees. They have a lot of revenue capacity, and so have the universities done the best with the resources they can today before shutting down library hours, before raising tuition. And it's Governor Scott's position that he does not support tuition increase under any circumstance at this point.
I'm going to weigh in on this one because, and I think as a moderator, I'm going to, I don't know what it is, invoke.
Moderator's privilege.
Yeah, there we go, moderator's privilege. But this is also something that is.
And I've always wanted to debate a dean.
Yeah.
Now that I've graduated,
There we go.
this is fun.
All right, this is when we get knocked down, drag out time. It is interesting to look at the proportion, as Kim mentioned, the proportion of state funding for universities in this state has significantly declined over the last, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, by maybe 25 or maybe close to 30% in some cases. And so that meant in order for us to maintain, and as she mentioned, there's really sort of dynamic among 3 variables. There's cost, there's quality, and there's access. So if you increase the cost, you're going to reduce access because people can't afford it, right? So and if you increase quality, well, that costs more. So then, you have the access issues. So it's a real dynamic tension between those 3 things. One of the things that Florida State, in particular, has been really, really good at is access. So we've worked really hard to make sure, in particular, that we have a high proportion of first-time in college students, for example. We do a better job than most of the state institutions at graduating first-time in college freshmen or first-time in college students. But those are mostly people that don't have the means, can't necessarily pay the cost. So then you have to look at tuition remission or student aid or those kinds of things. So the real question then is, if there's going to be reduced state support, and as Kim mentioned, we do have other sources of income in the university, but it means we need to get more from those other sources to maintain the same access and the same quality. One of the things that President Barron, you may have heard mentioned in his State of the University address yesterday, I believe it was, where he talked about our national ranking as a university, where we actually have gone up in the rankings in terms of measures of quality, where at the same time we've gone down in the rankings in terms of overall financial resources. And sort of what does that mean? I mean, I think one of the things that it suggests is that we've been very efficient as a university in using the funding that we do have. But I think it's going to come down to questions to the legislature, I think, this year, of what do you really want the universities to do? And what are you willing to pay for it? And are you willing to provide additional support? The Pell Grant is an interesting issue because of that is support for students. Are there any students here on Teach Grants? Any students on Teach Grants? That's another area of funding that wasn't mentioned in the questions, but it's funding provided by the federal government that is to incentivize students to go into teaching, and they're called Teach Grants. And one of the proposals would be under a Romney administration would be to, as he mentioned, you heard the clip, bundling and giving to the states a lot of things that are now being managed by the federal government. And it's unclear what the impact would be on the teach grants. There is some mention that they would become contingent upon the programs being high quality programs, but the definition of program is quite different from what you and I might consider to be a program. And so there is some concern, I think, from the Obama administration that would be going in the wrong direction, particularly in areas where there are high needs for teachers. So that's my dean spiel for the evening. Let me ask any other comments that our panelists would like to make on issues of the funding, particularly.
I'll chime in from a little bit of a legislative perspective to Kim's point of the wrestling between how do you protect both access and quality and keep costs manageable, bright futures. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are in the audience who are here on a Bright Futures Scholarship, which is an academic scholarship that is incredibly popular. And one of my final few years in the legislature, that was something that we wrestled with a lot, as the cost of Bright Futures was escalating beyond the legislature's ability to fully fund. And yet, how do you protect this program that's allowed so many high academic students, some of them who were, except for the Bright Futures program, probably would have never thought that they could go to college for whatever reason in their family background, but because there was some way that they could prove themselves and show themselves that they had this door open to them. And so how did we protect that access while also covering the financial obligations that the state had to incur? And from what I've heard and studied in the Pell Grant, that is something the federal government will be wrestling with, because there is what's happening in the Pell Grants is kind of what Florida went through with the Bright Futures a few years ago, where the need, particularly in this economy, where you have more people who are struggling economically, more people qualify for a low-income assistance. There's an unfunded mandate coming down the road in the Pell Grants to the tune of, well, everything in the federal government is to the tune of billions of dollars. So I think it's like $50 billion of some sort that is coming down the pipeline that, regardless of the administration, is going to have to be dealt with at some point, which will make Kim's world much more interesting, because they will have to deal with how to fund from a state level an uncertainty of what is the federal assistance that's going to be added to that formula, and then how do we make sure that kids are still able to access. I'm a graduate student at FSU. It's kind of weird to be in this side. I'm used to being on that side. And so those are the things that you pay attention to more, especially as a student, going, what is the future going to look like as far as access?
Right. And Students First is dedicated to changing public education and improving it, but K through 12. So obviously we want to supply universities with a better educated population. So I'm primarily focused following this story and following this issue as a parent of two seventh graders who are in an IB program and very much concerned about what school they're going to go to at 12 and a half. And so I'm going to be following it even more so as we get through the election and see kind of what happens.
So now is your turn. I'd like to open this now to audience questions, and please direct them to any one of our panelists or to all three.
So I appreciate you all being here. I think one of my questions has to do with school choice. It's something that I'm not very knowledgeable on. I'm a higher education student, so K-12 is not my expertise. But when you allow students to move, doesn't that cause some schools to kind of lose their upper echelon of students? And does that leave some schools in the dust with really just the bottom part of their academically achieving students? And how do you address that? Because that would seem to be to expand the achievement gap. So I don't know who.
I'll take a stab at it first. It's actually, the reality in most cases has been the converse of that. Because a lot of your choice options are built around helping the lower performers, whether it's the lowest performing academically or special needs, or maybe it's a socioeconomic status. So it's actually kind of been the opposite. There was a lot of discussion and concern, particularly when new choice programs are being put. They often call it cherry picking. Will schools be able to cherry pick to choose which students they have, and so make their school look better? And the reality hasn't worked out that way. Particularly in charters, a lot of times, and you may be able to speak better to this than I, but a lot of times charters will target specifically low-performing academic areas or economically disadvantaged areas, which goes in to really provide a whole form of resources around not just academics. The flip side of that, to one of the issues the dean brought up, is in that first year, particularly sometimes in that second year, those charter schools don't get a good grade. And so then everybody says, oh, this charter school's a low performing. You say, well, but look where it went. It went to a place where they knew that they were getting the tough cases, so to speak.
Right. And when I talk to parents all over the state, they're the students that are the happiest, or their needs are being met in a school, don't really have much cause to leave. It's the students that aren't getting their needs met. And so those are the parents that want to know about all their choices, want to know about their options. And so my job is to kind of help them. I've held parent advocacy workshops all summer long where I help parents of kids who are struggling in a school. And those are the ones that really want to access their choices and kind of see what other schools are out there. And she's right, there are charter schools that specifically target undervalued neighborhoods, at-risk youth, and those are the ones that they're helping to kind of rise up and out of poverty through choice in schools.
One of the things perhaps that it's useful to know is that there is a very broad array of different kinds of charter schools. And you may not be aware, but the Florida State University College of Education actually sponsors 2 charter schools. They're actually both charter laboratory schools. One of them is affectionately called Florida High, which is probably the one many of you may have heard of. Florida State University Schools, which is a K-12 school. We have 1,700 students, and it's located out in the Southwood area. It used to be on campus, but when they wanted the med school, guess what? They took the school. And so we moved it off campus. But that school is one that mirrors the demographic of the state. So we use a very complicated formula for determining what seats are open to make sure that we're admitting students that it's a very broad range of socioeconomic status, of ethnicity, of achievement, and so on. We also have a charter school in Pembroke Pines, Florida, which is right next to Fort Lauderdale, for those of you not familiar with the downside of the state. It's a K-5 school. It too is a laboratory school, and that adds another kind of twist to it in that it's an opportunity for us to partner with the school in various kinds of research, try out curricula, try to be innovative, and do things that wouldn't necessarily happen in a traditional sort of public school. The Pembroke Pines School has a greater proportion of Hispanic students in it, but it too tries to cater to a relatively broad SES. So we have students from, we probably have a preponderance of students from lower SES than we do from the high end, which when they moved to Southwood for Florida High was a bit of an issue because Southwood initially said, oh yeah, we're going to build lots of housing, that's going to be mixed housing. Well, that didn't quite happen. They built a lot of stuff that was sort of higher end, but we've really tried in both of the schools to make sure that we're catering to the lower needs schools. But that was a great question. Yes?
I wonder if we might embrace partisanship for a few minutes. And, I think that based on our discussion, maybe we have a little bit more clarity when it comes to national politics and education, perhaps. But I think we shouldn't forget that one of the things that we'll be doing in a few weeks is voting in the state legislature. And so I think I would posit this first to Jaren and then maybe Kim secondary is, what are some of the differences between Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature in terms of education? What are some of the things that they advocate for? Not necessarily whether they're good or bad, but are there differences that we should know about as voters based on their experience?
In the world of education, it actually is the partisanship, so to speak, is narrowing, particularly at the federal level. And you will see that a lot when campaigns are all about showing contrast, and there's been a lot of chatter in the federal and the presidential races. Why isn't education more front and central in the debates and in the discussions between President Obama and Governor Romney? And that is because there's actually a lot they really do agree on, and it's really only in some of the finer matters of how do you define school choice and to what extent you're going to promote it is really where the greatest disparity is in opinion, and which doesn't lend itself well to the way our system and partisan system of elections and campaigning, and so thus education doesn't get talked about as much. At the state level, and really because education policy, the way it's set up in our country, is more of a state focus. The feds do kind of ancillary, they fly high, they provide some funding, they'll do different programs like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top at different times. But the day in and day out, what is impacting you as a college student, or you when you were in K-12, if you have siblings who are still in the K-12 system, it really happens at the state level and at the district level. And in Florida, there has been a broader disparity throughout the years. That it is narrowing, and if you Google a couple of the different races, there's actually some discussion and debate going on right now over some races that the cases being made were decided because of school choice. And probably the school choice issue is the most passionate, the one where people fall on the most broad line. So you have Republicans have tended to be more pro school choice over the years. They were the ones who led the charge, so to speak, to open up beyond the public school system. But in recent years, Kim mentioned the Corporate Tax Credit Scholarship, which is now known as the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship. That has been a bipartisan support for that, with Democrats and minority leaders on both sides of the aisle leading the charge to expand that, to provide more funding, to let more students have access to the program. The McKay Scholarship Program, which is a voucher for students with disabilities, has also been one that has had a lot of broad bipartisan support. But you'll still see, for the most part, when it comes down to the terms of, the school reformers versus the establishment versus the status quo, the different terms that they use, and it still for a large part falls along party lines, Democrats versus Republicans, but a lot of that is changing. And when I was saying you could Google, there's a case going on right now, and it's actually two Democrat primary opponents who are suing over election results in South Florida, but it was a Democrat who was very pro-school choice, and he was battling it out with someone who was not school choice, and they're alleging that some absentee ballots, and I'm not really, but it just shows, I bring that up to show the example of the cusp of partisanship in education reform, and education policy doesn't fall along clean political lines like we would anticipate.
Can I just jump in and piggyback a question on that?
Mm-hmm.
So, wouldn't you agree that the issue of teachers' unions is quite partisan?
Yes.
So,
I would agree with
elaborate on that just a little bit.
And I think that goes, I will elaborate that from my perspective to kind of the political side of politics and campaigning, and who are the people who are knocking on doors, and the grassroots, and historically the grassroots component of the teacher unions have supported Democrats, so, and they still continue to do so. So in that world, I think that's largely why it follows. I have a political science undergraduate degree, which my father likes to remind me is not really a science, but and so I haven't studied it as a science, but I think from that perspective, it is still very much a partisan issue, and I think it falls down to just kind of boots on the ground when you're out campaigning, who's banging on the doors for Democrats, who's contributing more money to Democrats. Unions tend to contribute more money to Democrats, less money to Republicans.
And when you talk about, let's kind of dig into unions for a second, because they've been charged with being sort of the guardians of the status quo. And where I think the Republicans have said, well, we're for innovation, you're for keeping, because the Republicans, I think, have really pushed the issue of the merit pay, tying teacher performance to merit pay, where the teachers' unions have really said, well, we're out for all the teachers, and teachers, by and large, aren't paid enough to begin with, and so we're trying to raise the salaries of everybody, not, because they're not up to what they need to be. So, reactions?
Well, I can speak from the grassroots part of it because I'm in outreach, so building a grassroots movement in Florida is my job. And I'm also coming from being a 25-year activist with the Democratic Party in Florida. And I can tell you that it's changing. And it may take a little bit of time to trickle up, but it is. When you talk about a bipartisan support for the McKay scholarships or for the tax credit scholarships, it started out, Democrats supported it a little, and then as we hear from more parents and as we hear from more students and from more teachers that really support these changes because they recognize that what's good for students is good for everybody, the unions are coming around. They came around on magnet schools. They've come around on tax credit scholarships, and I'm convinced they're going to come around on the rest as long as we continue to hear from more parents. So my job is during the session, I'm not here to speak for my members and to speak for Students First members. My job is to get them to Tallahassee to speak for themselves. And so the legislators aren't hearing from them and haven't heard from them, but that's changing. And the legislators that maybe are against this have never had a child in a failing school, have never lived in an undervalued neighborhood. And so they really need to hear from the parents that are dealing with these issues every day. And the more they hear from them, the more they'll listen, and the more these changes will happen.
Kim, I want to give you a chance to weigh in here.
I think the big elephant in the room is probably the most divisive, wherever you're from, issue is high-stakes testing. And I'll tell you my perspective of what's not high-stakes testing and the perception that some folks have that it is high-stakes testing. There's actually, our kids take the FCAT and soon Common Core State Standard Assessment in 3 through 8th grade, then we're going to end-of-course exams in high school. But there is a high-stakes test in 3rd grade. If you can't read, you don't get promoted to 4th grade. I think that is the right policy. You first up to 3rd grade, you learn to read. After 3rd grade, it's all read to learn. And we're not doing anybody any favors by promoting them to the next grade when they can't read. So that is high stakes. But however, in the law, there's also good cause exemptions because you're talking about 3rd graders. And if they have a disability, if there's 5 exemptions. So it's not the test and that's it, game over. It's a reasonable, rational gateway. The next gateway, 10th grade, it used to be you had to pass the 10th grade APCAT. Okay, well that in 1979, it was a high school competency test. At some point, there has to be a value to the diploma, and your student have to be able to understand, can you do math? Can you do science? And that's the value. So to me, they're not high stakes, the state assessments that we have. Districts may put additional parameters or regulations. If you don't pass this, you can't move up to the next grade. But as far as the state goes, it is in the school grades. School grade is accountability. Everyone should understand and know how our students are doing in reading, writing, and math, because that's why we pay our tax dollars for kids to go to schools. So I don't see it as high stakes, where the other side, they see it clearly as high stakes. And the only thing tied to all of this is the school grade for the school. It's the school grade and school recognition money. It's not the majority of any school's money. It's a little bit of money. And it's a school advisory council made up of parents and teachers that decide how the school advisory money is spent. That's high stakes. To me, that's not high stakes. To the other side, oh my God, it's this test. It's not. And so I just have a very, very different view than those that try to put all this pressure on the FCAT when it's not. By the way, the adults put pressure. You can walk into some schools, and if you're teaching to the standards, which remember the standards that we have are developed by teachers, even when we go to the Common Core State Standards, teachers are engaged and said this 3rd grader, all 3rd graders should know this in science. All 3rd graders should know this in math, so they do it for the different grades and the different courses. If you teach the standards, your kids are going to pass the test. If you sit there and stress the little kids about the test, they're going to be stressed about the test. So it's very interesting when you go into different schools, and I've seen both schools at its worst case, and then best schools where the kids are like, oh, it's the FCAT. I can show I know the standards. It's very cute. So it's just really interesting that the adults have been the one to put a lot of the pressure on the kids. That's how I see it. Tell me if it's any differently.
A liberal Democrat, and I agree with her. I think that my kids are in a school that, yeah, they show they know, and it's not even an issue. When people complain, you have to remember, I think there are 68 school districts in Florida, 67 school districts in Florida, and it really comes down to how that school district decides to implement and whether they're doing it in a productive way or a destructive way.
Well, I'm going to press you a little bit on this issue because if you look at, for example, some of the countries where we've been compared unfavorably to, and one of the video clips talked a little bit about that. We were 20-something in science or whatever. And you look at countries like Finland or Singapore or Korea. Yes, they have some standardized types of tests as well, but they don't use them in the same way that we do. They use them to inform teachers about student progress and about what kinds of diagnostic information they can give to not only help students learn more and learn better, but also to improve the quality of the instruction. They don't use them to grade schools. They don't use them to allocate funding. They don't use them to determine what teachers are going to be paid. And so they look at us and kind of go, "What, you crazy Americans? Why are you doing this?" Reactions?
Well,
that's
sure.
Like
easy.
Well, there's a couple different things to respond. I'll start with grading schools is to me a type of diagnostic, only it's diagnostic to the community and to the parents. So the teacher, and they should, especially in the 21st century, it boggles my mind that my cousin just got back from Africa, and he's in the military, he was deployed, and his child could talk to him, 2.5-year-old on Skype could talk to his daddy in Africa, and for some reason we can't get a test back to students, which we will be able to because we have 21st century technology, and that's part of Common Core, to have that turnaround time between the student taking the test and the teacher getting the data back. They still get it now, and they'll be able to get it a lot faster. So the test is diagnostic and tells the teacher, what does the student know? The grades tells the community and the parents, what does the school know? And as a parent, I'm not a parent, but I'm sure you want to know if I ever am, what is the status of the school? How good is it? How is it performing? How are the students doing? To Kim's point, yes, there is funding that is built on the grades, and I'm going to correct my numbers because mine might be a little bit old from when I was in the system. We have a $22 billion K-12 budget, I think, all told, and the school recognition money, which is the money tied to the grades, is like 100-something million. I mean, it's a very small point. Now, I'm going to ask a question of the dean because we've been doing some research on these, because it is a very valid, she brings up a valid point. There are countries that are really high performing. What are they doing? Mm-hmm. And we're in the initial stages of research on this, but the bar to be a teacher and the requirement on their colleges of education is off the chain from what we can tell. Now, we haven't delved in to see what is that, and you're right earlier in saying we don't pay our teachers enough. We look at the teaching profession as almost a trade as opposed to a profession like lawyers and doctors, and it really should be on the same scale and the same echelon of professional careers as lawyers and doctors. But if you're a doctor and you screw up, guess what happens? Lawsuits out the wazoo, your license could be yanked, you're out, you're blackballed. Why? Because there's so much at stake in what a medical doctor is doing. And so we give them a lot of prestige, we give them a lot of accountability. There's a lot at stake in what teachers are doing today. I mean, I can remember, I'm sure all of us sitting here can remember one, hopefully more than one teacher that at some point in our educational career we thought, what the heck am I doing? And that person believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves. Or we were completely stumped and they helped us. Other countries do it better than we do when it comes to preparing our teachers, making sure that the ones that are in the classroom are the best of the best. And if teaching isn't the thing for you, just like maybe the medical school wasn't the thing for somebody, they're much better at weeding that out than we are in a country. I don't know. Maybe you have even know more about it than we. This is something we just are kind of delving into.
I could go on at length, I think, about this topic, and I would just say a couple of things, and that is there are preparation programs that only accept, let's say in Finland, it's 10% of the students who apply to teacher preparation are admitted into the program. But it's interesting because by statute in this state, teacher preparation students, in order to be admitted into a teacher prep program, have to have a higher GPA than for any other major on the campus. Now, in some cases, we have limited access programs, and so they're even higher than the mandated standard. So we admit more than 10%, clearly, and so there's certainly room for improvement. I think there's a lot we could do, and there's a lot I think we could learn. But I see a question, and I don't want to get too far afield.
Jerry, you kind of alluded to a personal problem I've had about weaving through all these complex and nuanced issues in education. There's talk about school choice and charter schools and everything like that. But to my mind, if we really want to get at root causes of fixing education, I think we need to address early childhood education and development, and also teacher preparations. That seems to be, to me, why those other countries are succeeding where we're lagging behind, is because they put that much more emphasis on teacher preparation and high standards for teachers and everything like that. So, bringing it back to the platform distinctions, can we derive anything from either President Obama's platform or Governor Romney's platform in terms of what they plan to do about teacher prep or early childhood development, or is that something that's outside of their jurisdiction? Is that because it also seems like it's just the nature of politics that education is not prioritized in our country. There's defense and things like that. So maybe that's something that their platforms can't even address because that's just the nature of the United States of America.
It is the nature in the teacher prep programs because those are colleges of education which vary by state. So in those, I would say, don't lose heart that the president isn't talking about it. What that means for you, to Josh's earlier question, is the legislative and the governor's races in the state that you're in are critical. What are their positions on education? The federal government has different, much like they have the Pell Grants and the Title I, they have Healthy Start type programs and that support early childhood development, that support helping parents be better. There's a couple different literacy foundations that are out there that focus on helping parents become better readers to their children, recognizing parents are the first teachers. And so the federal government provides funding support for those, but really the actual boots on the ground policy changes that impact happen at the state level. And that's where those legislative races, the governor's races, Florida doesn't have an elected commissioner, but in the states where there's an elected education commissioner or what is the Board of Governors, those positions at the state level are really critical to pay attention to. They don't get as much time on cable networks, but for the day-to-day policy, they impact it.
Kim, did you want to jump in?
I just think that a big program too is the Federal School Readiness Program. We have 33 coalitions, and we also have it's in our Constitution, the voluntary pre-kindergarten program for 4-year-olds, which is focused on academic standards, and then you have the school readiness. But absolutely, the more you invest in quality programs for kids before they come to school ready, your return on investment is what you're looking for. And she has a question way back there. I keep wondering what her question is. You have been.
All right. I'm curious to know if there was ever talks about there being a cumulative type of test in Florida, because as a student of the generation of FCAT will die pretty much. Like if you don't pass the FCAT, you will die. I'm just curious to know because I remember going to school, they put so much emphasis about the FCAT and benchmarks and stuff that we weren't really learning about things that mattered. So when we got to college, we were confused. I didn't know how to write a research paper, but I knew the Pythagorean theorem because that's all they drilled in us with the FCAT. And so I was wondering if there was ever talks about them being a cumulative test, because I feel like if there's a cumulative test where you let teachers do whatever they want in teaching their kids, that they'll get a better result than them learning about reading about FIDO and basic questions on that?
Well, that's an interesting concept. Let teachers do whatever they want.
Not do whatever they want to teach.
In theory, in the way a good teacher and a principal in a good school that it works, you have the standards. So we have the Next Generation Sunshine State Standards, and we're moving to the Common Core State Standards with 45 or 46 other states. And the whole goal is to give the teachers freedom. Like not every teacher in every classroom in third grade is going to be flipping the textbook at the same time. Teachers, because they're all gifted and they have their different strengths, teach the standard. And like a teacher shouldn't be surprised by their student scores on the FCAT. You're given quizzes, you're given tests, you know where the kids are, and it should not be drill and kill. I would be bored as a teacher, so I question the teachers that do the drill and kill and some of the experiences you have. That cannot be fun for a teacher. So why would you be doing that? If you make it fun for the teacher and you make it fun for the students, your students are going to learn and know the standards. That is bad. And that's part of the reason why in the past it was one of the reasons I left the teaching profession. I had a horrible student intern experience. I mean, just horrible. And it was in New Orleans, because I'm a Cajun. I devoted the rest of my professional career to changing it. And I also was looking at my financial situation and looking at your starting salary, and you could figure out for the next 30 years what your step payment's going to be. And I'm thinking, I see Jane, she's a 20-year teacher, I'm better than her, because when you come out of college, you all that. And I was like, I can do that better. I had to teach first aid and health. I'm like, oh, I can do health so much more fun. But she was going to make more. So I think part of it is where everyone was headed towards the performance pay. Is that it used to be about highly credentialed teachers, and now it's about highly effective. Not even high quality. Are you effective? And to me, it's kind of crazy that I love the unions. Governor Scott sitting down, we're having conversations with the union. It's disheartening to me as someone that left the teaching profession, and I think I'm truly a teacher, is that why education reform came not from within. If you don't do it, someone else is going to do it to you. So all of these years, it's been very interesting that more reforms haven't come from the groups that are representing the teachers. Because the teachers know what works best. So wouldn't the teachers be the one that could figure out the reform? And yes, you need to know whether you're being paid to what? To teach. At some point, you need to have a mechanism, an assessment for your evaluation. Did you teach and did the kids learn? I can have fun all day teaching, but they're not getting it. I have to be a good teacher because I went to a college of ed, knowing you better get the feedback. Do you know how your kids are doing? Do you know how to teach the trucking? But you got all these little pods of kids, and you better be a good teacher and know and you're going to get results. And so there's just, I could go on all night, but I know y'all are just getting an hour credit or half a credit or homework or something, and you want to go home. But I'll be happy to come back and debate Dean Driscoll on anything. That's the way I am. And she can be right, and I can be right, because I think we're all right.
Let's go here first, and then there, and then over there, and then back to Josh.
My question is kind of a different direction, but how can federal or the state government help community colleges in attracting disadvantaged or non-traditional students, especially when you look at how well for-profit schools have attracted that population of students?
You're looking at me because I got higher ed. All of a sudden, I'm higher ed. I know K-12 too. It's affordability. It's absolutely affordability. And affordability is the number one driver. If you can't afford to do it, you can't go. And it's access, I think, with virtual education in higher ed. And I also think that we have to make better state policy decisions. We have part-time kids in state colleges. We have part-time students in higher ed. And are we doing the best that we can with them? And another whole reform thing that I haven't talked to Dean Driscoll about is our state colleges unfortunately do way too much remediation. Are you kidding me? So you have to have a market value of the diploma. And actually, Florida implemented some policies, I think it was maybe 2 years or 3 years ago, where kids used to just graduate and then go take this little test and go, oh my God, I have to remediate, and it's not counted towards credits towards my degree. But now actually, in 11th grade, you take the PERT. So in your 12th grade in high school, if you need remediation to be what we call college ready, you're going to get it in high school before you go on to college campus. So as far as the kids that are leaving the high school, we have to do a much better job with remediation in high school. And I think that helps because if the kids are just churning through, whether they're returning or going straight through, and they have to keep churning in remediation courses, they're going to get frustrated. They're going to be like, I am so not into that. You know, they're already old when they go back to TCC, and they keep getting older every year. They're not moving towards their dream to get the degree, and then they're racking up costs. So I'm not sure that the state college system, and they're calling it developmental education. I'm like, it's remediation. That's just a different term. A big summit at the end of this month to bring in national people to talk about how they can do a better job. We spend a lot of time in our K-12 reform looking at professional development, looking at instructional strategies that work in the K-12 system. Kind of like accountability reform is going up, trickling up. I think it's, you know, how many debates or discussions have you had about the quality of instruction in the classroom on a higher ed campus? You know, you have professors you love and professors you like and professors you got to take. But really, there hasn't been a whole lot about actually teaching professors how to teach most effectively.
Except on this campus.
Except on this campus, except for my Seminoles.
Yeah.
They're always number one.
And to Kim's point, FSU, we were very fortunate that our prior provost put a lot of emphasis on teaching at this campus. And one of the things that he did, and I can tell you our faculty weren't crazy about it, but he took student evaluations and looked at them very carefully and said, you know, let's really dig into them and see, are there patterns that would indicate whether there are issues with the faculty members teaching. And he kept what he called the notorious 90% list and 30% list. And the 90% list is 90% of the students rating the teacher, the faculty member, as excellent or good on the overall, you know, how effective is this person. And the 30% list is 30% rating them poor or fair. And if a faculty member got into that 30% list, the first time it was a warning, the second time it's, you better start thinking about doing something about it, and the third time is, it's absolutely required. You have to have a teaching performance plan in place. So it really ratcheted up, I think, the quality of teaching on this campus. There was a question here. Here it is.
My question is about the achievement gap, and this is for anybody. So we know for sure that the achievement gap is predominantly rooted in poverty. Not necessarily just in race, because you can have students, of course, from rural communities who are white, so it really is an economic thing. So my question is that I'm speaking as a teacher, but I guess as anybody in the education community, we know that we want to teach our kids regardless of what zip code they come from. If they're on a voucher or however they get to us, we want to make sure that we're giving them the best that we can. But it seems really interesting that for poverty being the main root of this issue, there isn't a huge emphasis on poverty reform in education reform. So how do we have some way, as a teacher, I know I can't personally revolutionize a zip code. I mean, I can do my best job in the classroom as I can, but that's not something I'm trained to do. But it seems like the expectation is I can get the kids out, which may not be the right type of thinking. So where is the place in poverty, or how does poverty have a place in education reform so that we're not teaching students despite their zip code, but we're actually making them thrive in that zip code? That, you know, that there has to be some sort of connection that I just don't think we're really addressing.
Well, I think in one sense, to a certain degree, you're right, you can't look at it separately, but while there's education reform going on from a state policy perspective, and I'm sure Kim can expound on it, there is healthcare services going in, there are Medicare services going in, there's also, I could name every area of the budget where there are services to help in low-income areas. And so, I mean, if you pull education out by itself as a policy, is there a lot of services within the education policy world particularly geared to low income? Not necessarily, but if you push it back into what is the state providing as a whole, there are low income services that are provided, and there are some within the education after school programs that are geared towards low performers. This year, Governor Scott put in extra money for after-school reading programs because we know, and those go to the low-income areas first by default, because we know that a lot of our struggling readers also happen to come from disadvantaged areas, and the money for these after-school programs in the budget said the low-income areas, the most struggling areas, get it first. And so you will find that when you get down into the details of the budget, you'll see a lot of times when money is expended there's a priority system because we only have so many dollars, and a lot of times it is prioritized to where's the highest need. And sometimes that tracks with low income because we know the data shows there tends to be a higher amount of academic need in the most low income areas. Not always, and at the end of the day it should go to the most important need. And then there's like additional services in other areas of the budget that go into. I don't know how you could do it much more beyond that unless you start, because in the world of just education reform, like you said, you can only control what's in the classroom. When your student walks in your door is when you have impact on them and your interaction with them through your position as a teacher. And if you just take purely the education section of policy in the budget and base it on itself without looking at all the other areas of services provided through the government, it's the same thing for the government. Like in the confines of the education, there's a limit of what they can tinker with. But just like there's a limit of what you can do. You can't change their home environment. You can't change their zip code. You can only adapt what you do in the classroom with them. If just the confines of the education budget siloed, education policy siloed by itself, from a state policy perspective, it's similar, which is why I think it's important to look at it globally. What are we doing as a whole from a government perspective to help come alongside people who are struggling, regardless of what it's for? Low income, academic struggling, whether they're low income or not, whatever it is, how are we helping them be more successful?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I want to see, obviously certain things done about income inequality, and I want to see certain things done about healthcare, and having, making sure that undervalued neighborhoods get more valued. But I also am very passionate about not using it as an excuse. Ability and intellect are widely distributed, but opportunity is not. And so there are schools that serve neighborhoods where 1 in 10 of the kids will graduate from college, and after a few years they've raised that number to 4 in 10. And they're doing something right, and they're controlling what's in that school. And so that school can then help to transform that neighborhood. And so I am convinced from all the talks that I've had with parents and my own experience as a teacher of at-risk youth and criminal youth, that you can take these kids who are from the most dire circumstances and help them improve and help them get up and out of poverty. It's not necessarily thriving in poverty, but it's better. It's getting them out of it. And education is absolutely the best way to do it. And there's too many examples of people that are doing it. So while in my non-professional life, I work very hard to try to get services and opportunity to those neighborhoods, in my professional life, I will not sacrifice those kids until that happens. I'm going to promote and replicate schools that'll help them while we're working on the other.
There was a question in the back? Yes.
Thank you for that short one. I know on the ballot this year there are a lot of amendments involving exemptions for property taxes, and if I'm not mistaken, a property tax fund for schools, so would that have an effect if either way?
Ooh, I don't know to what degree, because that's really specifically, you are right. A lot of property tax funding goes into education funding, but it funds other stuff as well. And I don't know if Kim knows better than I the formulas of
Property
the impact.
taxes impact your local school funding.
Yeah.
Because we have a state contribution and a local contribution, so property taxes are a substantive source for your traditional public schools.
Isn't
And
it the case
charter
that these days the property tax is a little bit more than half of the funding for schools? I think it just
I'll have to
flipped.
go back and look.
I want to say it just flipped in the last couple of cycles to where the property taxes now fund a little more than half of schools. Question?
I came from Hollywood, Florida, if you know where that is. And let's just say that Hollywood is not the best neighborhood. It's pretty bad. Like in my school, there was like a 40% graduation rate. And I went to South Broward High School. What I'm asking is that I have a lot of friends that are extremely intelligent. but they don't have money to go to college. Some of them can't go because some of them are immigrants, and it's just a bad situation. What I'm saying is that you talk about charter schools, and that I had a choice to go to one if I wanted to. I never heard of this. No, nobody in my school has ever heard of this. Like all my friends, if I ask them, they'll just be, "What are you talking about?" No one informed me of this. None of my teachers informed me of this. Basically, not like nobody. I mean, I'm sure you can find it online, but I mean, it's kind of like we need some information to go by. It's like kind of like find a needle in a haystack, but first you don't even know that the needle even exists. So it's like I have to deal with that situation. And the second thing is that I'll be frankly honest. Obviously since I have a 40% dropout rate, and it's not that in my school everyone's an idiot. There's a lot of intelligent people, but things that I found that high school education is that it is boring. For one factor, is that teachers are, at least in my opinion, teachers, they don't care about the students that much. I've had teachers that literally, they would say, like, one of my teachers actually gave up on their students. They're like, you know what, you take this class as an elective, do whatever you want. And I had teachers like that. And also, while teachers don't teach creatively, they teach like a textbook, and it's boring. I never enjoyed it. Teachers just, I think that these teachers were horrible. I mean, I can understand why there's a 40% dropout rate. I mean, honestly, I used to be one of those kids. I'm like, high school. I'm like, what's the point of this? I'm lucky I'm even in college in the first place. I had to work really, really hard to actually come to college. Not because of the academic work, but also social issues. My parents, my dad, basically his job, he was a graphic designer, and over here, that job is like non-existent. You can't find work. My mom works 2 jobs, and she's a teacher actually. And it was very hard for me to come here just for a lot of factors. I mean, and also just economic situation. So what I'm asking is that how are you going to basically help out kids to find out about this information? I didn't know about it. My friends didn't know about it. I don't even think my teachers knew about it. So
we need to spread the word.
That's why Catherine's job is so
I'm working on it. But
we need more of her.
Yeah, we have 100 and close to 150,000 members in Florida, but there are a whole lot more people than that.
Yeah.
And I'm one person. So I'm going to just do a plug real quick. I have a table back there of lunchboxes and pens and brochures about Students First. We need your help. Yeah. We need your help to get out and spread the word about your stories, about your experiences, and also your ideas for solutions. You're the next generation. You're the generation who's going to come up with innovation and ideas. And we're not just here to complain, obviously. We're here to kind of think through these issues and find what works and then replicate it and promote it. So there are membership cards back there. It is free to be a member of Students First. Please fill one out. And then I'll circle back, I'll get in touch with all of you, and we'll talk about ways to improve public education so that fewer students have to go through what you went through. That's what we need, more involvement. So please, before you leave, make sure that you give me your contact information or take mine so that we can be in touch.
Josh, you next.
So, President Barron, the president of the university, serves at the pleasure of the Board of Trustees. So does Bernie Macken, the president of the University of Florida. I've watched both presidents and the University of Florida State were the flagship universities in the university system. I've watched both presidents sit in front of the legislature and say, we need to raise tuition in order to keep our professors from getting picked off from other states. But then you say that Rick Scott is categorically against raising tuition. So I guess to Ms. McDougall, I would say, in that situation where you have university presidents that are saying we need to raise tuition, I'm not saying I agree with, and the governor saying we can't raise tuition, I think it presents a kind of an awkward situation. What do we do in that situation? Because I think that's what we're in right now. It's the situation we're in.
It's not awkward if you believe that accessibility and affordability should be there, and there's He doesn't believe in increasing tuition. There's other revenue sources the university could look at. They could look at, you have to look at, and this is the governor's, why he has this position. General revenue is spent in the university system. There are lots of families that pay taxes and never send a kid to a university. So it's not just the state money, it's the Florida's families' money. And you have to look at when we're going through this economy, and Governor Scott is doing his best to bring new jobs and to get the economy going. But with the current financial situation, we don't borrow from China. We have a balanced budget every year. We're not California, and there are tough decisions that have to be made. And so at this time, do you want families to be putting more out of their pocket, to be paying for increased tuition and limiting access and affordability to some? Or do you want to say live within your means with what you have now, make greater efficiencies, and let's get through this and let's grow Florida back to a place that's even stronger than it was yesterday? And it's simply a difference of opinion, and both parties are very passionate about their beliefs. But at this time, Governor Scott feels it's the best policy for Florida.
Do I get to disagree?
You work for your president, I work for my governor. I would expect no less. This will be the last little post if you disagree with the president.
What jobs are available for recent graduates, specifically who have gone to graduate school, that allow them to affect change in education policy?
I'll tell you how I got started at the legislature. We have a 60-day session, and so I was in college actually, and thought I wanted to be involved in state policy, and so I started looking to see what were the opportunities at the legislature. I had been a page as a high school student, and so I noticed that they hired temporary employees to come in and help for 60 days, and I lived here in Tallahassee, and so I could do that and not have to move. And so I took an application and thought, let me try it for 60 days. If I can survive 60 days, then I'll see if I really like this whole policy making thing. And I ended up staying for 10 years. And I didn't make policy the first 60 days. I answered a lot of phone calls and filled a Rolodex of business cards this long. Talk about, going digital into a database so that the person would no longer have a Rolodex. This was a long time ago. I won't say what year it was. But, there's positions like that. There's analyst positions. If you're a graduate student, they're always looking for, in the committees, analyst positions. There may not be one in the education committee available, but if there's an analyst position opening, a lot of times you can crisscross over. So maybe you start out in agriculture committee, or you might be able to find maybe transportation, and you might not be studying education policy, but you might be studying transportation issues around education. And just you getting your foot in the door from a legislative perspective, that was how I was able to do it, was just starting out and then kind of being willing to do, frankly, grunt work for a little bit, and then work my way into different positions and say, okay, I want to learn about this. And I actually did transportation policy for several years until an education ended up in education. And then I know there's internship, the legislature does internships, and then it's a fabulous internship program, and I think the governor's office does as well.
And we have interns as well. We have teacher fellows. I think, from my point of view, I started out as a history and political science major. I graduated from the University of South Florida, and then I worked for AMI schools, which I taught high school, and so we got our students from the Department of Juvenile Justice. They committed a crime and were sentenced to our program, or we got them from the school board. They were expelled or suspended from school, and that's how I started. And then I went and taught at a traditional public high school, but I interned for Democratic candidates, both locally and statewide, worked on campaigns. I'll tell you, canvassing in rural Florida for Lincoln Caucus in 1988, well, that's one of the best educations you can get. So, it's grunt work, going door to door and knocking, and getting doors slammed in your face, but you learn a lot. And I think all of that kind of helps you prepare. I went through the alternative certification program in Hillsborough County to be a public school teacher, and all of it played a part.
And actually, this is a great place for you all to be if you're interested in education policy, because Florida is on the forefront of education reform. It has been for years and years, and it's a very, very dynamic and interesting place to be and to work. And so I would certainly encourage you, if you have those interests, to talk to our panelists afterwards. We are out of time, so I'm not going to take more questions, but I do want to thank you all for coming. It's been very, very interesting, so please join me in thanking our panelists.